everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. So today we're going to be talking about tropes and whether or not tropes are a good or a bad thing to implement into your writing. We talk a lot about tropes in the writing and reading communities. It's a word that gets thrown out a lot in both positive and negative contexts. Essentially, a trope is an attribute or a device used in a piece of writing that is used so commonly that it starts to feel like a convention. Tropes are often associated with specific genres, the tropes of fantasy, the tropes of romance, etc. But plenty of tropes can traverse or transcend genres as well. In fact, some tropes are so common that they may appear in the majority of books in a genre. For example, in romance, the meet-cute trope, which is a trope when the two love interests meet in an unexpected but serendipitous kind of way, is so inherent to the genre that we don't even really think of it as a trope anymore. It's something that we can expect to see in the majority of romance novels. Other tropes, though, can be very divisive. Another common trope that you see in romance, and actually in any genres that might feature a romantic subplot, is the enemies to lovers trope. This is a very divisive trope. Some readers adore it, others hate it. Some readers might talk about tropes as a highlight of the book. This book had all the tropes that they love. So they're referring to the inclusion of these tropes and ultimately the execution of these tropes as a positive thing. But in other cases, we might talk about tropes as a negative thing. Some tropes are so overused that they start to feel cliche, whereas others may be offensive or rooted in stereotype. This is why tropes can be such a confusing topic. It can be hard to know if there's something to embrace or avoid when we use the word trope in so many different and often loaded contexts. It's rare that people refer to tropes as a completely neutral thing. They're often being discussed in kind of a love it or hate it manner. We often refer to books that are unoriginal as tropey, but then we also see writers successfully pitching their books based on the tropes they've included because both publishing professionals and readers are looking for these specific tropes. So ultimately, the term trope is neither a positive or negative thing. It really depends on the specific trope being discussed, as well as the context it's being discussed within and the specific tastes of the writers and readers involved. Some tropes are generally beloved by the majority of readers in a genre, whereas others are pretty much outright considered offensive and to be avoided. But the term trope on its own isn't really a good or bad thing. It's just a word we use to describe an attribute that you see commonly enough that it can become recognizable. We've seen enough books with this attribute that we can start to label it as a trope. And as writers, this can help us identify if maybe the work is maybe relying too much on tropes and could use some more original ideas. Or it can also help us identify how we want to market our books based on the tropes involved. It's actually really interesting to see how recently books are being marketed based on their tropes. They're not just being marketed based on their genre or concepts. They're actually being marketed based on the tropes in the book. So I think the word trope used to have maybe a bit more of a negative connotation, but it's actually being used as more of a positive thing now, as readers are seeking out books with specific tropes, and writers are using the tropes in their books to actually find readership. It's a really interesting shift in how we see the term. So let's talk about some tips for how to use tropes intentionally and effectively in your work. First of all is to use tropes intentionally. When implementing tropes in your story, you want to be doing so because you genuinely enjoy this trope and you think it's going to be a benefit to the story you want to tell. Maybe it's even a core aspect of the story you want to tell. What you don't want to do is implement tropes because they're just so common in the genre that you didn't really think of it. This is often what leads to tropes feeling flat or overdone. It's when they're just being regurgitated without much thought, rather than being used intentionally in the story. That is the difficult balance to strike with tropes. By nature, they are something recognizable, which means they can risk being overdone. A trope that's used with intention because the writer wants to feature it in their story can be really effective. But when the writer just reaches for a bunch of tropes without much thought because they've seen these things in their genre so often that they don't really stop to consider what they actually want out of their story, and instead are just retelling what they've seen over and over. This can be the difference between a really skillful use of a trope that readers find really exciting and a book that feels tropey and overdone. In the latter case, the book is too reliant on tropes, but it's not being done with much thought. The second tip is to know the history of the trope. Many tropes are pretty innocuous, but it is important to know if the trope you're using could have any potentially offensive implications. Tropes rooted in offensive stereotypes should pretty much always be avoided unless you have the personal lived experience to skillfully and empathetically subvert this trope. Which leads to tip number 3, which is to subvert. Sometimes a trope starts to feel a little tired and overdone, but this is when subverting the trope, finding a spin on that trope that feels fresh, exciting, and original, can be especially effective. When a writer is able to take a trope that was maybe once beloved, but has started to feel familiar, and then they're able to make it feel new again, that can be so fun and rewarding. So if there's a trope you love, but it's pretty overdone, maybe even veering on cliche, see if you can subvert it, give it a new spin. This can be one of the most effective ways to implement tropes into your writing by playing with readers' expectations, taking something familiar and making it surprising again. And finally, tip number 4 is to avoid cliches by adding depth. Tropes run the risk of becoming cliches when they're overdone and lacking depth. For example, in fantasy, it's very common to have a medieval setting. Now, many books are able to do this successfully because they give depth to this setting. Whereas in other books, it feels like a cliche because it feels like the writer just reached for the most obvious setting that's popular in a lot of fantasy, but didn't put the work into giving depth to their world. This is the difference between a trope being done effectively and one that's turned into a cliche. You don't want to use tropes just because it was kind of the most obvious choice. You want to implement tropes thoughtfully and give depth to the trope every single time. This can be the difference between a trope reading as cliche and reading as an organic and rich part of the story. So that's all today on tropes. I would love to hear what your favorite trope is, if there's a trope that you just love including in your work. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Friday on this channel. Until next time, bye!